Chapter 1. Richard Ainsworth was out of his depth and out of his comfort zone. Also, if he carried on drinking this excellent Sauvignon Blanc at its current rate, he'd likely be out of his box too. A tasting menu soirée to celebrate the opening of Les Gens qui Mangent restaurant, coinciding with the promised return of Valérie dOrçay, had seemed too good to be true. And so it had proved. So, now Richard sat conspicuously alone at a table for two, surrounded by every local bigwig within a 50-kilometre radius in the Follet Valley, looking, as Humphrey Bogart had put it so eloquently in Casablanca, like a man who'd had his insides kicked out. He tried to refrain from taking another sip of wine, avoiding eye contact with the gleaming crystal glass for a moment, before giving in to its charms with a what-the-hell shrug. Immediately, a waiter was on him, quicker than a wasp at a picnic, filling his glass while wearing a look on his face that managed to be both obsequious and contemptuous at the same time. A Parisian waiter, thought Richard, trained in the secret art of slick silver service delivered with an impenetrable, almost phosphorus resentment. "A peu, monsieur," said the weaselly little man without looking down. His attempt at English proved the Parisian credentials beyond doubt, the "I'm better than you" one-upmanship the clincher, a pro brought into town for the fancy opening night. "Oh, go on then." Richard's joviality was forced. Also, he'd wanted to reply in French, just to let the man know he wasn't to be pushed around, but his instinct was to reply in English, as every damn Parisian-trained waiter knew. How had he even known that he was English? It wasn't as if Richard went about the place with a bowler hat on his head and a pot of tea at his side. He'd even made a huge effort with the language since he'd moved to France, and was just the right side of fluent, knowing that a full-blown multilinguist is never quite trusted, especially an English one, and jokey translating was always a good conversational icebreaker anyway. Sometimes he even pretended to know less than he actually did just to get things started. Maybe it was his suit, not worn for years, and the cut of which was, he'd been told, very English. He'd had no idea whether it was meant as a compliment or not, and had preferred not to pursue it. English style was very much admired by the French, but he wasn't sure that a Debenhams off-the-peg counted. Normally his clothes were standard middle-aged fare, smart without being flashy, maybe a snagged pulling a sweater away from the dreaded "he's let himself go" that the newly single man of a certain age should fear. But tonight he'd even ditched the string around his neck that held his reading glasses, and which stopped him from losing them. Inevitably, he now lost them on a boringly regular basis, but it had been at Valerie's suggestion, so he thought it a small price to pay. Richard suspected that it wasn't necessarily his appearance that gave his Englishness away, but a vibe, a sensibility, a very definable quality that made him different from all the French people in the room. It was an awkwardness of the high-end cuisine restaurant environment that betrayed his roots. Whereas the French accepted it naturally and behaved as if it was their birthright, Richard felt out of place, unworthy of his surroundings almost, an impostor about to be unmasked. Put bluntly, Richard's Englishness stood out like a battered saveloy on a bed of gratin dauphinois. That said, he thoroughly enjoyed his life in the wider Loire Valley, and his role as an exotic-ish foreigner in its quiet, slow-paced world. One of the locals, the rather giddy Janine, who ran the boulangerie in town, said that he looked a bit like the Earl of Grantham from Downton Abbey, which he'd never seen. Since then, however, he'd always tried to affect a stately manner when shopping for his daily baguette, which, if he was honest, was quite tiring and not his style at all, more used as he was to a kind of endearingly polite befuddlement. He just felt out of sorts this evening, that was all. Something was missing. Of course, it was obvious to everyone what that was, as the place opposite him, with its gleaming cutlery and empty plates, screamed, "He's been stood up." Damn it, he thought, nearly breaking the stem of his delicate wine-glass. When would the pitifully few women in his life, which at the moment amounted to 3, including his estranged wife, a demanding daughter, and his missing dining companion, when would they stop taking him at his word and start reading between the bloody lines? He hadn't been publicly effusive when Valérie had said she was coming to stay, but he'd hardly worn the granite coldness of a statue either. He thought you were supposed to play it cool. "Another top-up, monsieur,"